Human history is filled with moments in which the individual finds himself surrounded by forces that threaten to dissolve his identity, fragment his psyche, and annihilate his will to exist. In these moments of imminent collapse, when the external world becomes a battlefield and enemies multiply like shadows around a trembling candle, an essential question emerges. What sustains a human being when everything around him conspires to destroy him? Psalm 3 is not merely a liturgical or poetic text. It is an archeo-psychological map that reveals how human consciousness forges its inner sovereignty precisely at the moment of greatest external threat. This ancestral song, attributed to David during his flight from Absalom, his own son who sought to usurp the throne and eliminate his father, represents far more than a historical episode or a religious supplication. It constitutes one of the most profound documents about the process through which the individual self emerges from dissolution, reconstructs its psychological boundaries, and establishes an inner fortress capable of resisting both external and internal chaos. When we examine the historical context of this psalm, we find David at the most vulnerable moment of his existence, expelled from Jerusalem, betrayed by his beloved son, abandoned by much of his people, fleeing barefoot and in tears through the Judean desert. The biblical narrative describes a man who built a kingdom, defeated giants, unified tribes, and established a dynasty, now reduced to a political refugee with no guarantee of survival. This is not merely a personal drama. It is the universal archetype of the fall, of betrayal, and of the loss of everything once considered solid and permanent. Psychological archaeology allows us to see beyond the historical facts and recognize in this episode a pattern that repeats across cultures and eras. The moment in which the individual loses all external structures of support and is forced to discover whether there is something internal capable of sustaining him when everything collapses. Psychological differentiation, a central concept in analytical psychology and human development, refers to the process through which the individual separates himself from collective identifications, family projections, and social masks to discover who he truly is at his essence. This process rarely occurs during times of peace and prosperity. It is forged in the fire of extreme adversity, when all superficial defenses are stripped away and the person is confronted with their radical vulnerability. Psalm 3 documents precisely this moment of forced differentiation, when David can no longer rely on his role as king, on his reputation as a warrior, on his political authority, or even on his identity as a father. All those masks were shattered by Absalom's betrayal. What remains when all external identifications are destroyed? This is the question the psalm answers through its poetic structure and internal logic. The text begins with a brutal and unapologetic acknowledgement of reality. Lord, how my foes have multiplied. Many rise up against me. Many say of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. This opening is not melodramatic complaining. It is a clear and conscious recognition of the objective situation. Genuine inner strength does not arise from denying external reality, but from fully accepting it without illusions. David does not minimize the gravity of his situation, does not take refuge in comforting fantasies, does not deny that his enemies have multiplied, and that many already consider him condemned. This ability to look directly at chaos, to name adversaries, and to recognize the extent of the threat represents the first essential movement in the construction of inner sovereignty. The person who cannot see reality with clarity remains trapped in psychological infantilism that makes them vulnerable to repeated collapses. The development of inner strength begins with the courage to see what is, not what we wish it to be. The multiplication of adversaries described in the psalm is not merely quantitative, it is qualitative. When David speaks of many rising up against him, he is articulating a universal psychological experience, the moment when the threat ceases to come from a single identifiable source and instead comes from all directions simultaneously. This is the experience of existential siege, when the individual feels there is no direction they can turn without encountering hostility, judgment, or danger. To understand the psychological depth of this situation, we must recognize that external adversaries always have internal counterparts. Jung observed that the external world often materializes our unconscious complexes and unintegrated shadows. When David faces the multiplication of external enemies, he is simultaneously confronting the internal fragmentation of his own psyche. Absalom's betrayal does not merely threaten his physical life. It calls into question his entire identity as father, king, and man. Each external adversary represents an internal voice saying, "You failed. You are unworthy. You are finished. There is no salvation for you." The statement many say of my soul, "There is no salvation for him in God," represents the deepest possible attack on the psychological structure of an individual. It is not merely a physical or political threat. It is an attack on the very possibility of redemption, renewal, and existential continuity. When external and internal voices converge to declare that there is no longer any hope, that the individual is beyond any possibility of rescue or restoration, we are confronted with what could be called premature psychic death. The person is declared dead before their time, not biologically, but existentially and spiritually. This is a particularly insidious form of psychological violence because it undermines the very will to continue existing. When we believe there is no salvation possible, when we internalize the verdict that we are condemned without appeal, we lose the vital impulse that keeps us fighting, growing, and transforming. Psalm 3 records this moment of total assault on hope, but it does so precisely to document how consciousness can respond to this attack and emerge strengthened. David's response to this devastating realization does not come in the form of argumentation, denial, or any attempt to convince his adversaries. It comes as an inner affirmation that radically contrasts with the chorus of external voices. "But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head." This transition from verse 2 to verse 3 represents one of the most sophisticated psychological movements documented in ancient literature. David does not deny the reality of his adversaries nor the gravity of the threat. He shifts the center of gravity of his consciousness from a place vulnerable to external attacks to a place that remains inaccessible to them. This shift is not an escape from reality, but a change in the reference structure through which reality is processed. When we say that something is a shield around me, we are affirming the existence of an inner space that remains protected even when the exterior is under total assault. This is the essence of psychological differentiation, the ability to maintain a stable inner center regardless of external turbulence. The metaphor of the shield is particularly rich in psychological meaning. A shield does not eliminate the attack. It absorbs and deflects the impact, protecting what stands behind it. Genuine inner strength is not emotional impermeability or insensitivity to what happens around us. It is the ability to take the blows without being destroyed by them, to absorb impact without losing one's center. Many people confuse inner strength with hardness, with a kind of emotional armor that makes us rigid and inflexible. But true psychological resilience functions much more like a shield than armor. It allows movement, flexibility, and adaptation while maintaining the integrity of the protected core. When David identifies the divine as the shield around him, he is articulating the experience of a psychic center that remains intact even when surrounded by hostile forces. This center is not a construction of the conscious ego. It is something deeper, a connection to a source of sustenance that transcends the superficial personality. The expression, "my glory and the one who lifts my head," adds another crucial dimension to this inner response. Glory here does not refer to social recognition or worldly success, both of which David had lost in his flight. It refers to ontological dignity, the intrinsic worth that remains regardless of external circumstances. To lift the head means to keep consciousness raised, the ability to see beyond the immediate situation, to not be crushed by the weight of circumstances to the point of losing perspective. When a person goes through extreme adversity, one of the first signs of psychological collapse is the inability to lift their head, both literally and metaphorically. Severe depression often manifests in a curved posture, lowered eyes, an inability to look forward or upward. What David is describing is the opposite movement. Even in flight, even surrounded by enemies, even abandoned and betrayed, he keeps his head lifted. This is neither arrogance nor denial. It is the maintenance of dignity and perspective that allows one to continue functioning as an integrated human being rather than collapsing into a shapeless mass of defensive reactions and despair. The next movement of the psalm is equally significant. "With my voice I cry out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain." The voice here is not just physical sound, but the expression of subjectivity, the articulation of the self that affirms its existence through speech. Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Nazi concentration camps and founder of logotherapy, observed that one of the differences between those who survived and those who collapsed in the camps was the ability to maintain an articulated inner life, to continue speaking to themselves and to something beyond themselves even in the worst circumstances. To cry out is not merely to ask for help. It is to affirm that there still exists an I capable of crying out, a subjectivity not entirely annihilated by external forces. This act of crying out with one's own voice represents the fundamental resistance of consciousness against its dissolution. As long as we can articulate our experience, name our suffering, and direct our words towards something beyond the immediate chaos, we maintain a minimal psychic structure that can serve as the foundation for reconstruction. The response that comes from his holy mountain introduces the vertical dimension into the horizontal experience of siege. When we are surrounded by adversaries in every horizontal direction, when there is no lateral escape or possible flight within the plane of external reality, the exit must come from a different dimension. The holy mountain is not necessarily a geographical location, though it may refer to Mount Zion where the tabernacle stood. Symbolically, it represents a plane of reality that transcends the horizontal battlefield. This is a crucial perception for the construction of inner sovereignty. When external circumstances offer no escape, we must access resources that come from a vertical dimension, from deeper or higher levels of human experience. Genuine spirituality is not an escape from the horizontal world, but access to resources unavailable on that level. It is the difference between trying to solve a problem on the same level where it was created and accessing a level of comprehension that transcends and includes the problem, enabling new possibilities of response. When David says he cries out and that God answers, he is describing a dialogical structure of consciousness that is essential for psychological health. The self is not an isolated monolith. It is a dynamic multiplicity that dialogues with itself and with something it recognizes as greater or deeper than the conscious ego. Modern psychology recognizes that the ability to converse internally, to have different voices and perspectives within oneself, is a sign of mature psychological complexity, not pathology. The problem is not having multiple internal voices. The problem is lacking a coordinating center capable of relating to those voices without being dominated by any of them. When David cries and receives an answer, he is demonstrating this capacity for internal dialogue between the conscious ego in despair and a deeper source of wisdom or sustenance that can respond to that despair without being engulfed by it. This dialogical structure is what allows extreme experiences to be processed without destroying the psyche. The psalm continues with a statement that may seem trivial, but carries profound psychological meaning. I lie down and sleep. I awake, for the Lord sustains me. In situations of extreme threat, one of the first functions to deteriorate is sleep. Anxious hypervigilance keeps the nervous system in a constant state of alertness, interpreting every shadow as a potential threat. The inability to sleep is not just a symptom of stress. It is a sign that the organism does not feel safe enough to lower its conscious defenses. When David affirms that he lies down, sleeps, and awakens, he is describing something extraordinary. The ability to temporarily surrender conscious control, to enter the state of total vulnerability that is sleep, even while surrounded by enemies who literally want to kill him. This ability reveals a deep level of trust that goes beyond any rational calculation of safety. It is not that David is objectively safe. He is just as endangered in the moment of sleep as in any other. What has changed is not the external situation, but the internal psychic structure that allows him to rest even in the storm. The ability to sleep amid chaos is an accurate indicator of psychological resilience. People who develop genuine inner strength maintain basic rhythms of self-care, even in adverse circumstances. They eat when possible, sleep when they can, maintain some semblance of routine that anchors consciousness in fundamental organic processes. Those who psychologically collapse often lose these basic rhythms. They stop eating properly, cannot sleep or sleep excessively, lose all temporal structure. The fact that David can lie down, sleep, An awaken reveals that he maintains a fundamental trust in the continuity of his existence, a trust that does not depend on external guarantees, but on an internal structure of sustenance. This is the difference between functional fear, which keeps us alert to real dangers, and pathological anxiety, which keeps us in a constant state of terror that depletes all psychic and physical resources. The sentence, "For the Lord sustains me," points to the source of this extraordinary capacity. The sustaining power does not come from David's own strength, from his ability to protect himself, or from some external guarantee of safety. It comes from a source he recognizes as transcendent to his conscious ego, yet immanent in his lived experience. This is a crucial distinction in understanding inner strength. It is not self-generated in the narcissistic sense of someone who considers himself self-sufficient and independent of anything beyond his own being. That kind of pseudo-strength collapses quickly when tested because it is built on an inflated ego with no real foundation. Genuine inner strength recognizes its dependence on sources that transcend the conscious ego. Whether we call these sources the collective unconscious, the archetypal self, the spiritual dimension, or divinity itself. The paradox is that recognizing this dependence, far from weakening the individual, is precisely what allows access to psychic resources unavailable to the isolated and inflated ego. This understanding has profound implications for people in different socioeconomic contexts. For those living in poverty who face daily threats to physical survival and live with scarce material resources, Psalm 3 offers more than mere religious consolation. It offers a map for building an inner sovereignty that does not depend on material possessions or external safety. When there is no objective security, when the external world is truly hostile and threatening, the ability to find an internal center that remains stable becomes not a spiritual luxury, but a psychological survival necessity. Poor communities often develop deep forms of spiritual resilience precisely because they lack the luxury of relying on material buffers against adversity. The psalm validates this experience and offers a framework for understanding it not as passive resignation, but as a sophisticated form of inner strength. For the middle class, which often bases its identity and sense of security on external structures such as career, property, social status, and relationship networks, Psalm 3 offers a different but equally necessary challenge. When these structures are threatened by job loss, financial collapse, social scandal, or family betrayal, the middle-class individual often discovers that his inner strength is far less developed than he imagined. All his security was invested in external things that can be lost. The psalm invites a psychological differentiation that does not deny the value of external structures, but does not place the entirety of identity or self-worth upon them. This differentiation does not weaken a person's ability to deal with the external world. It strengthens it because it allows one to navigate losses and transformations without total identity collapse. For the upper middle class and those close to power and influence, Psalm 3 presents a particularly uncomfortable mirror. Absalom was not an external enemy, but the beloved son who grew up in the palace and had access to all the privileges of power. The betrayal came from within the intimate circle, from someone who had every reason to be loyal and protective. This is an experience intimately known by those in positions of power and privilege. The discovery that neither status, nor wealth, nor social connections guarantee loyalty, love, or safety. On the contrary, the more one has, the more one attracts those who want to take what one possesses. The psalm does not offer strategies for maintaining power or recovering lost status. It offers a path for discovering an identity and worth that do not depend on these things. For people accustomed to exerting control over their environment through material and social resources, this is a radical invitation to discover a form of power that does not depend on external control, but on inner sovereignty. The psalm then makes a declaration of trust that appears irrational given the objective situation. I will not fear 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. This is an extraordinary statement. David is not saying there is no reason to fear, that the enemies are not really dangerous, or that everything will turn out fine. He is saying that despite abundant reasons for fear, despite objective danger and real threat, he will not fear. This is the difference between the absence of fear, which would be naivete or denial, and the transcendence of fear, which is genuine courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act with integrity even in the presence of fear. What enables this transcendence is not brute willpower or emotional repression, but the transformation of the psychic structure through which fear is processed. When he says, "I will not fear 10,000s," David uses a number that signifies countless multitudes, overwhelming forces, total threat. The temptation in extreme situations is to collapse into paralyzing terror that prevents us from thinking, planning, or acting. Pathological fear does not protect us, it immobilizes us. The development of inner strength includes learning to modulate the fear response so that it informs us of real dangers without incapacitating us. This modulation is only possible when there exists a psychic center that is not completely identified with the fear mechanism. If we are entirely our fear, then when fear arises, our entire capacity to respond collapses. But if there is a center of consciousness that can observe fear, recognize it as a natural response to real threat, but not be fully dominated by it, then we can function even in situations that objectively justify intense fear. The phrase, "who have set themselves against me all around," reiterates the experience of total siege, of having no safe direction to turn. This is one of the most destabilizing psychological experiences possible. When we are attacked from one direction, we can defend ourselves by turning toward that specific direction. But when the attack comes simultaneously from all directions, normal defensive strategies become inadequate. This is the moment that forces a qualitative transformation in one's response. We cannot defend ourselves adequately on the horizontal plane. We must access a different dimension of response. This is precisely the function of spiritual and psychological development, to offer resources unavailable to more superficial levels of personality organization. Total siege forces either a descent or an ascent, a penetration into depths of the psyche where resources exist that we did not know we possessed. The psalm then shifts from declaration to supplication, but a very specific type of supplication. "Arise, O Lord, save me, my God." This is a battle cry, not a helpless lament. David is not asking to be spared the battle or removed from the difficult situation. He is invoking resources to face the battle effectively. The verb arise suggests something that was latent but now must become active, potential that must become manifest. Psychologically, this represents the invocation of deeper or higher aspects of the total personality that normally remain dormant but can be mobilized in moments of extreme need. Transpersonal psychology and contemplative neuroscience have shown that human beings have access to states of consciousness and psychological resources that we do not habitually use, but that can be activated through specific practices or under extreme pressure. What David is doing is consciously invoking these deeper resources. When he says, "Save me, my God," he simultaneously recognizes his need and his connection to something that can respond to that need. The capacity to ask for help is itself a form of strength, not weakness. People with pseudo-strength often have enormous difficulty recognizing need and asking for help because their false self-sufficiency collapses the moment they admit dependence. But genuine inner strength can be vulnerable because its stability does not depend on maintaining an image of invulnerability. True inner sovereignty includes the ability to be interdependent, to recognize that we are part of relational networks that sustain us and that we, in turn, sustain. This interdependence does not diminish individuality. It completes and strengthens it, because a mature individuality knows it cannot exist in a vacuum, but only in relation. The supplication continues with a statement that may appear violent. "You strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked." This violent imagery must be understood in its symbolic and psychological context. Teeth symbolize the capacity to devour, destroy, consume. When internal and external voices attack us, they often do so through devouring language, criticisms that attempt to consume our self-esteem, our sense of worth, our will to exist. Breaking the teeth of enemies is not necessarily about physical violence. It is about disabling the power of these voices to consume us. It is about establishing psychic boundaries that prevent destructive criticism, malicious judgment, and attacks on our dignity from penetrating to the core of identity. Striking the cheek destabilizes the adversary's ability to articulate its attack. rendering it powerless to continue its destructive campaign. This imagery also reminds us that the cultivation of inner strength sometimes requires healthy aggression, the ability to say no, to establish firm boundaries, to refuse to participate in dynamics that diminish us. Many spiritual traditions emphasize compassion, acceptance, and nonviolence to such an extent that they end up creating individuals incapable of appropriate psychological self-defense. Genuine inner strength includes what we might call sacred aggression, the ability to fiercely protect the integrity of one's soul against forces that seek to violate or devour it. This is not gratuitous violence or vengeance. It is appropriate psychological self-defense. When someone seeks to destroy us, psychologically or physically, we not only have the right, but the duty to neutralize that threat, to break the power it holds over us. This breaking may be literal in cases of physical self-defense, but more often it is psychological. The refusal to internalize destructive judgments, the ability to see through malicious projections, the power not to be defined by the attacks we receive. The psalm concludes with a statement that shifts the focus entirely from personal drama to broader recognition. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be upon your people. This conclusion is remarkable. After all the focus on personal threat, on surrounding enemies, on fear and danger, David ends not with a petition for himself, but with a desire for blessing upon the entire community. This final movement reveals the difference between narcissistic individualism and genuine individuation. Narcissism remains trapped in its own situation, unable to see beyond its immediate needs and wounds. Individuation, on the other hand, is the process by which we become whole individuals who, precisely for that reason, can transcend the limited ego and include the well-being of others within our concern. Even in flight, David does not forget his people. His personal prayer expands to include collective blessing. This capacity to hold awareness of personal needs alongside communal needs is a mark of deep psychological maturity. The statement "salvation belongs to the Lord" is both a theological recognition and a psychological insight. Salvation here is not merely rescue from physical danger, but the restoration of integrity, the renewal of the possibility of continued meaningful existence. The recognition that this salvation comes from a source beyond the conscious ego is liberating, not limiting. It means that we do not have to generate, through sheer willpower or individual capacity, all the resources necessary for our survival and flourishing. We can access resources larger than our limited consciousness, resources available when we open ourselves to them. This openness is not passivity. It is an active form of receptivity, a posture that recognizes that being part of something greater strengthens us rather than diminishes us. Modernity often confuses autonomy with isolation, independence with disconnection. But true autonomy emerges from conscious connection with sources of meaning and sustenance that transcend the isolated self. When we examine the full narrative arc of Psalm 3, we see a movement that can be mapped psychologically as the process of transformation through crisis. The psalm begins with clear recognition of threat, of siege, of the multiplication of adversaries, and of the internal and external proclamation that there is no hope. This is the moment of confrontation with reality, when all illusions are shattered and we see clearly the magnitude of the challenge before us. This recognition is painful but necessary. Without it, we remain in denial, which prevents us from mobilizing the appropriate resources for the real situation. The second movement is the shifting of the psychic center of gravity from dependence on external circumstances toward connection with an internal sustaining source. David does not deny the enemies, but he ceases to define them as holding ultimate power over his fate. The third movement is the maintenance of basic rhythms and essential functions even in the midst of chaos. Sleeping, waking, continuing to exist. The fourth movement is the declaration of fear transcendence, not by denying fear, but by accessing a center that is not fully identified with it. The fifth movement is the active invocation of deeper resources, the arise that mobilizes latent potentials. And the final movement is the opening beyond personal concern to include collective well-being, the blessing upon the people. This narrative arc is not merely an ancient text. It is a map that can be applied to any existential crisis, any moment in which we feel surrounded by forces that threaten to destroy us. The practical application of this map begins with the courage to name and recognize the reality of the threat without minimization or dramatization. Most people become trapped at one of two extremes. They either deny the gravity of the situation and maintain a false optimism that prevents them from taking appropriate measures, or they catastrophize to the point of becoming paralyzed by terror. The psalm teaches us to see clearly but without despair, to recognize the magnitude of the threat while maintaining connection with sources of strength capable of responding to that threat. The next practical step is identifying where our true psychic center of gravity is located. When everything is collapsing externally, where do we find support? Some people discover that their sense of worth was entirely identified with things that can be lost: social position, specific relationships, particular achievements. Losing those things results in an identity collapse. Others discover that over time they have cultivated a connection with something deeper that remains accessible even when external structures fall apart. This connection may be spiritual in the traditional religious sense, but it can also be a connection with core values, with vocation, with creativity, with the ontological dignity that does not depend on external circumstances. Maintaining basic rhythms during crises is another crucial aspect of practical application. When everything is chaotic, the temptation is to abandon structure and allow external chaos to completely invade the internal organization of time and activity. But precisely in moments of greatest external chaos is when we most need internal structures that anchor us. This does not mean rigidity or an inability to adapt. It means preserving fundamental elements of self-care: adequate sleep when possible, basic nutrition, physical movement, moments of reflection, and silence. These simple practices do not solve the external problem, but they preserve the integrity of the psychobiological system that must function in order to respond to the external problem. People who collapse during crises often do so because they stop tending to these basic elements, entering spirals of exhaustion and dysregulation that compromise their ability to respond effectively. The ability to function despite fear is perhaps the most transformative aspect of the Psalm's practical application. Fear is a necessary emotion that alerts us to real dangers. The problem is not feeling fear, but being completely dominated by it to the point that we lose the ability to respond appropriately. Cultivating the ability to observe fear without becoming identical to it is a fundamental spiritual and psychological practice. Contemplative meditation, mindfulness, emotional regulation techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy, and somatic practices all work with this same basic capacity, creating space between the emotion and the consciousness that observes the emotion. When I can observe my fear, recognize its presence, validate its function, yet not be completely engulfed by it, I develop the freedom to choose how to respond instead of reacting automatically. This freedom is the essence of inner sovereignty. The invocation of deeper resources, the arise, save me of the psalm, can be translated into contemporary practices in various ways. For people with an active religious tradition, this may literally mean prayer, participation in communal rituals, reading sacred texts, and devotional practices that connect them with their spiritual source. For people without formal religious affiliation, it may mean secular contemplative practices, immersion in nature, deep engagement with art and music, connection with communities that share values, or deep therapy that accesses unconscious layers of the psyche. The common point in all these practices is that they move the person beyond exclusive identification with the conscious ego and its immediate concerns, opening access to psychic resources that are not available at the level of ordinary consciousness. These resources are not magical. They are dimensions of the human psyche that exist but remain latent without intentional cultivation. The final opening toward collective well-being, the movement from personal concern to blessing over the community, has profound practical implications. Research in positive psychology consistently shows that one of the most effective ways of dealing with personal suffering is engaging in actions that benefit others. This is not a denial of one's own suffering or repression of personal needs. It is the discovery that we transcend ourselves when we place ourselves in service of something larger than our immediate problems. People who go through severe crises and find ways to help others who are suffering often report that this action is therapeutic for themselves, not only for those they help. This occurs because serving others connects us with sources of meaning that transcend our particular situation, and because we discover that even in our weakness and woundedness, we can be a source of strength and healing for others. This discovery deeply transforms one's sense of identity and worth. The development of inner strength documented in Psalm 3 is not a linear process or a one-time achievement. It is continuous cultivation that involves repeated cycles of challenge, response, transformation, and integration. Each crisis we face using these principles strengthens our ability to face future crises. We develop what psychologists call resilience, which is not a fixed trait, but a dynamic capacity that grows through use. People who never face significant adversity rarely develop deep resilience because they have never been forced to discover internal resources beyond the superficial. On the other hand, people who face adversity without any framework of meaning or support are often traumatized rather than strengthened. What makes the difference is the presence of meaning structures, sustaining practices, and supportive communities that allow adversity to be processed in a transformative rather than merely destructive way. The inner sovereignty cultivated through the principles of Psalm 3 does not make us impermeable to suffering or immune to wounds. We continue to feel pain, fear, sadness, and all normal human emotions in response to difficult situations. What changes is our relationship with these emotions and situations. Instead of being completely defined and dominated by them, we develop the capacity to hold them and process them without being destroyed. This containment is not repression. It is the ability to give space to difficult emotions without being engulfed by them, to feel fully while maintaining access to resources that can respond constructively. It is the difference between being a leaf carried by the current and being a swimmer who respects the strength of the current, yet has technique and strength to navigate through it. This inner sovereignty has implications not only for individual well-being, but also for the health of communities and societies. People who develop genuine inner strength do not need to dominate or control others to feel secure. Their security comes from within, not from power over others. This makes them capable of genuine collaboration, of relationships based on mutual interdependence rather than domination and submission. Societies composed of individuals with strong inner development are less vulnerable to demagogues who promise security in exchange for submission, less prone to scapegoating and violence against marginalized groups, and more capable of facing collective challenges through cooperation rather than fragmentation. The development of inner strength, far from being a spiritual luxury or an individualistic escape, is a necessity for building resilient and humane societies. Psalm 3 teaches us that true strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the ability to remain integrated and functional even within vulnerability. It is not invincibility, but resilience. It is not total control over external circumstances, but sovereignty over our internal response to those circumstances. It is not self-sufficient isolation, but conscious connection with sustaining sources that transcend us. It is not emotional hardness, but flexibility that allows us to absorb impact without breaking. It is not denial of reality, but the capacity to look directly into chaos and find emerging order at the very center of our being. This is the strength that allows human beings to pass through situations that seem impossible to survive and emerge not only as survivors, but transformed and matured by the process. When David wrote this psalm in the midst of his escape, at the moment of greatest vulnerability and danger of his life, he was doing more than expressing personal feelings or reciting religious formulas. He was documenting a psychological process through which human consciousness reconstructs itself in the midst of collapse, finds center within chaos, and discovers resources when everything seems lost. This document has traveled across 3 millennia and remains relevant because it describes archetypal structures of human experience that have not fundamentally changed. Cultural details shift, specific circumstances vary, but the basic structure of existential crisis, psychological siege, threat to identity, and the need to find a foundation that cannot be destroyed remains constant. Each generation must rediscover these truths in its own terms, but the maps left by those who navigated these waters before us remain valuable. The contemporary application of these principles requires cultural translation that respects both the ancient wisdom and modern needs. We cannot simply replicate ancient practices in modern contexts and expect the same results. The world has changed, the human psyche has developed new capacities, and it faces new challenges. But the fundamental principles remain valid. The need to recognize reality without denial, the cultivation of an inner center that transcends external circumstances, the maintenance of basic practices that sustain psychobiological integrity, the development of the capacity to observe emotions without being dominated by them, the access to resources that transcend the conscious ego, and the opening beyond egoic concern to include collective well-being. These principles can be expressed in traditional religious language or contemporary psychological terminology, in ancient contemplative practices, or modern therapeutic techniques. The form varies, but the essential structure remains. What Psalm 3 ultimately offers is hope that is neither denial nor cheap optimism, but the deep confidence that there is something within us and beyond us that can respond even to the most desperate situations. This hope does not guarantee that everything will turn out well in the external sense, that we will recover what we lost, or that we will be spared from suffering. It guarantees something deeper, that we can pass through suffering without being destroyed by it, that we can lose everything externally and still preserve our essential dignity and integrity, that even when surrounded by 10,000 adversaries, there remains a center that cannot be surrounded because it inhabits a dimension that transcends the horizontal battlefield. This is the promise and the challenge of the psalm. To discover the center through the very process of being tested to the limit, to forge inner sovereignty precisely at the moment when all external sovereignty is destroyed, to emerge from the valley of the shadow not as someone who was never threatened, but as someone who was threatened to the limit and discover that there is something within them that cannot be threatened.